she whispered, locking the door. I gripped the desk to stay still. The click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot in the empty expanse of the Chicago high-rise. Outside the glass walls of my office, the trading floor was entirely dark, bathed only in the distant amber glow of the city skyline. Madeline Gardner stood framed in the doorway, her hand lingering on the brushed steel lever. She wore a silky champagne blouse, slightly unbuttoned at the collar, reflecting the muted light. I stood behind my desk, wearing a light gray dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to my elbows, my knuckles turning white against the heavy mahogany edge. The tension in the room wasn't air, it was water, filling my lungs until I forced myself to exhale a slow, measured breath. "Marcus pulled the servers offline," Madeline said. Her voice didn't shake, it never did, but I noticed the way she pressed her thumb hard against the side of her index finger, a nervous habit she reserved only for absolute catastrophes. "I know," I replied. My tone was clipped, the professional cadence I used when a corporation was bleeding money. I saw the network drop at 8:14. She turned fully to face me, stepping away from the glass door. She wasn't just my rival for the managing partner seat. She was the architect of the firm's most lucrative division. For 3 years, we had circled each other in boardrooms, our interactions limited to sharp nods and competing financial projections. Now she was standing in my domain, completely isolated. I watched her scan my desk, the scattered ledgers, the glowing monitors displaying offshore routing numbers, the cold cup of black coffee. "He's filed a formal complaint," she said, moving closer. The faint scent of rain and dry paper followed her. "Documented negligence. He claims my department authorized the Cayman transfers. He has receipts, Theo. Forged, but they look perfect. He's aiming for my equity." I released my grip on the desk, feeling the dull ache in my fingers. I didn't cross the room. I shoved my hands deeply into my pockets, feeling the cotton lining stretch against my knuckles. It was a conscious choice. If I took my hands out, I might reach out to steady her, and I couldn't afford that lapse in discipline. "You need a temporary workaround," I stated, analyzing the chessboard. "You need someone with access to the raw data cache to trace the timestamps before the board convenes on Monday." Madeline stopped 3 feet away. Her eyes, sharp and exhausted, locked onto mine. "I need you to fix it." The request hung in the quiet room, a sudden, irreversible shift in our gravity. I pulled a blank legal pad toward me, picking up a pen. I didn't look at her immediately. I looked at the numbers. "Sit down, Madeline," I said softly, flipping to a fresh page. "Tell me exactly what Marcus thinks he hid." We didn't leave the building until 3 in the morning. The HVAC system had shut down hours ago, leaving the air heavy and stale. Madeline sat on the leather sofa against the far wall, a binder open on her lap. I stood at the whiteboard, a black marker in hand, mapping the financial arteries of the firm. Marcus had been meticulous. As the head of compliance, he had the clearance to backdate authorization forms. The threat was a documented campaign of sabotage, specifically designed to trigger the termination clause in her contract. If she fell, Marcus absorbed her portfolio. "He routed the first anomaly through the Frankfurt subsidiary," I explained, drawing a sharp arrow across the board. "He used a shell vendor, but he made a mistake with the currency conversion timestamps. He logged the trade in Central European time, but the server handshake was authenticated in Chicago." Madeline closed the binder. "Can you prove it?" "I can," I said, capping the marker. "But it requires a joint audit. The bylaws state that any internal investigation into an executive requires 2 signatures, mine and yours. A formal partnership contract filed with the board." She rubbed her temple, a micro-tell I caught instantly. The firm was her life's work. To sign a joint audit meant tying her professional survival directly to my reputation. It meant forced collaboration, every day, until the truth was extracted. "If we file the partnership," she said slowly, Marcus will claim we're colluding to cover your own tracks. Let him, I countered, walking back to my desk. I pulled the standard internal audit agreement from my drawer. I slid it across the wood along with a silver pen. I don't care about Marcus's narrative. I care about the server logs. If we sign this, I have the authority to bypass his compliance logs. Madeline stood up and approached the desk. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the pen and signed her name with aggressive, fluid strokes. The sound of the nib scratching against the paper was the loudest thing in the room. She pushed the paper back to me. We're partners then. I looked at her signature. Then I looked at her. I didn't offer a reassuring smile or a hollow promise. I took the pen and signed my name next to hers. The ink dried, locking us together in a system that was designed to break us. The friction started on Tuesday. The audit forced us into a windowless conference room on the 42nd floor, a space filled with humming servers and stacks of printed manifests. The air was dry, smelling of ozone and hot electronics. You're moving too slowly, I told her, pointing to a stack of invoices she was cross-referencing. We don't need to verify the client names, we only need the routing numbers. Madeline didn't look up from her laptop. Optics matter, Theo. If the board sees we skip the client verification, Marcus will argue the audit is procedurally flawed. We check everything. Process is a shield for the incompetent, I replied, my voice clipping. I am looking for a mathematical certainty. The numbers don't require context. She stopped typing and looked at me. Her posture was perfectly straight, an armor of absolute professionalism. I am not a spreadsheet. I am a person with a reputation on the line. We do it my way, or the board throws out the findings. My jaw tightened. She was right, but acknowledging it meant yielding control. I was used to operating alone, isolated in the certainty of data. Working with her meant adjusting to a different rhythm. I stepped back, creating a deliberate pocket of space between us. Fine, I said, keeping my voice low. We verify the clients. But I take the Frankfurt ledgers. I can process them twice as fast. Later that afternoon, the first real test of our fragile alliance occurred. Marcus walked into the conference room, flanked by 2 junior compliance officers. He smiled, a thin, practiced expression. Theo, Madeline, Marcus said smoothly, I'm afraid I have to suspend your access to the offshore accounts. Standard procedure when an audit touches sensitive client data. Madeline stiffened. I felt the sudden drop in the room's temperature. Marcus was a powerful man, and he was executing a textbook corporate block. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I casually flipped a document over on the table, revealing the bylaws. Section 4, paragraph B, Marcus, I said, my tone entirely flat. A joint audit authorized by 2 managing partners supersedes departmental blocks. If you shut down our access, you are in direct violation of the firm's charter. I will have the board revoke your compliance credentials by dinner. Marcus's smile faltered. He looked at the document, then at me. I held his gaze, offering absolutely nothing. No anger, no bluster, just the cold, measurable reality of the rulebook. You have 24 hours, Marcus clipped, turning on his heel and leaving the room. When the door clicked shut, the silence rushed back in. I didn't gloat. I returned to my laptop. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Madeline let out a shaky exhale. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. I had defended our ground, and she knew it. The boundary was set. By week 3, the conference room had become our entirely self-contained world. The relentless grind of the audit stripped away the formal veneer we had maintained for years. We stopped wearing suit jackets. We communicated in shorthand, anticipating each other's needs with a quiet efficiency that felt heavier than conversation. It was Thursday night, past 10. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass windows, a steady, driving rhythm. I was tracing a complex web of shell companies on the main monitor, my eyes burning. Madeline was sitting across the table, her head resting on one hand as she read a contract. I watched her for a moment. I noticed the dark circles under her eyes. I noticed that she hadn't touched her coffee in 2 hours. I felt the sudden, irrational urge to cross the room and simply stand behind her, to offer a physical barrier against the exhaustion. I kept my hands in my pockets. Instead, I walked over to the climate control panel and quietly bumped the heat up 2 degrees. Then I pulled a fresh bottle of water from the mini fridge and set it next to her notebook. I didn't say a word. She looked at the water, then at me. "Thank you," she said softly. "Drink it," I replied, sitting back down. A few minutes later, she frowned, her finger tracing a line on the contract. "Theo, look at this." I stood up and moved to her side of the table. I kept a careful foot of distance between us, leaning over to look at the document. It was the vendor agreement for the Frankfurt subsidiary. I read the text quickly, my eyes locked onto subsection C. It was a liability trap, a tiny, densely worded paragraph that shifted all financial responsibility to the signing executive in the event of a regulatory fine. Marcus had slipped it into her annual renewal. "He buried a poison pill," I said, my voice hardening. "If you had signed this, he could have triggered a regulatory audit and bankrupted you personally." Madeline stared at the paper. "I almost approved it yesterday." "You didn't," I said. I pulled a red pen from my shirt pocket and drew a brutal, thick line through the entire subsection. I flipped to the back page and drafted a swift, legally binding amendment that neutralized the clause. "We rewrite the terms. He accepts the amended version, or we flag it to legal as an unauthorized alteration." She looked at the red ink, a visible representation of protection. "You caught it. It's my job to catch it," I said. But as I looked down at her, the proximity felt suddenly dangerous. I could smell the faint vanilla of her perfume. The air in the room felt entirely still, the noise of the rain fading into the background. I stepped back, retreating to the safety of my side of the table. The distance was necessary. It was the only way I could keep her safe. The email arrived on Monday morning of week 4, carrying the weight of an anvil. It was a formal legal notice from the board of directors. Marcus had escalated. Madeline read the email aloud, her voice tight. "Due to irregularities discovered in the preliminary review, the board is initiating a 48-hour deadline. If conclusive proof of Marcus's malfeasance is not presented by Wednesday at noon, the joint audit is terminated, and my equity is frozen." The midpoint twist was a hammer blow. The time cushion was gone. Madeline stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. She wrapped her arms around herself. It was the first time I had ever seen her look small. I walked over to her. I didn't touch her. I stood shoulder to shoulder with her, staring out at the same bleak view. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "I spent 12 years building my division," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It was a raw, unprotected confession. "I sacrificed everything for this firm. Relationships, vacations, life. And he's going to take it away with a forged timestamp." "No, he isn't," I said. My voice was low, carrying the absolute certainty of a mathematical proof. She turned her head to look at me. "Theo, we are missing the final link. We have the routing numbers, but we don't have the IP address of the terminal that executed the trades. Without that, it's circumstantial." I looked at her tired eyes. "I know, but we have 48 hours. That is 2,880 minutes. I only need 1 minute to find the flaw in his system." She exhaled a shaky breath. She didn't cry, she just nodded. The shared vulnerability didn't weaken us, it anchored us. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I walked back to the computer and started typing. The hunt accelerated. The pressure of the deadline began to fracture the edges of our routine. By Tuesday evening, the exhaustion was palpable. Marcus walked past the glass walls of our conference room twice, offering a smug, victorious glance. Doubt crept in, not about the data, but about the outcome. Madeline was quiet, her movements mechanical. The weight of the impending board meeting was crushing her. I opened my leather-bound task list. It was a habit I maintained to keep my mind organized. I looked at the top of the page. Under the heading for Wednesday, I didn't write board meeting. I took my pen and wrote 2 words. Madeline Gardner. It wasn't a task, it was a commitment. I treated her survival as an absolute, non-negotiable objective. "I need to make a call," Madeline suddenly announced, breaking the silence. "I know a vendor in Frankfurt. If I can get him to admit on record that Marcus bypassed the standard intake protocol, we have the leverage." I looked up. "That's a massive risk. If Marcus monitors the vendor logs, he'll know we're closing in." "It's my risk to take," she said, her voice firm. She pulled her phone out. "I'm not sitting here waiting for the clock to run out." I watched her dial the number. She wasn't asking for permission, she was taking command. She paced the room, speaking in rapid, fluent German to the vendor. I listened, catching enough of the terminology to understand the negotiation. She was aggressive, clear, and uncompromising. She didn't let the vendor deflect. She demanded the intake receipts. 10 minutes later, she ended the call. Her chest was heaving slightly. She walked over to the printer. A moment later, a document slid into the tray. She picked it up and placed it squarely on my desk. "Receipts," she said, "showing Marcus's personal authorization code on the shell transfers. He bypassed my department entirely." She had produced the documentation. The manipulation was revealed. I looked at the paper, then up at her. I felt a surge of profound respect. She wasn't a damsel waiting to be saved. She was a shieldmate who had just brought the ammunition. The boardroom was a theater of mahogany and leather, filled with the 12 senior partners of the firm. Marcus sat at the far end, looking relaxed, a folder of polished lies resting in front of him. The clock on the wall read 11:55 a.m. Madeline and I walked in together. We didn't sit. We stood at the opposite end of the long table, presenting a united, unbroken front. "The deadline has arrived," the senior managing partner stated, adjusting his glasses. "Theo, Madeline, do you have conclusive proof to justify this disruption?" Marcus leaned forward. "With respect, this audit was a desperate attempt by Madeline to deflect from her own departmental failures. The numbers are unambiguous," I interrupted. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with surgical precision. I opened my briefcase. I didn't pull out a speech. I pulled out a stack of bound, verified ledgers. I slid them down the polished table. "These are the Frankfurt server logs," I stated, walking the board through the timeline. I was the most prepared person in the room. I had cross-referenced the IP addresses, the timestamps, and the currency conversions. I dismantled Marcus's narrative, not with emotion, but with crushing, undeniable data. Furthermore, Madeline stepped in, her timing flawless. She placed the vendor receipt on top of the pile. "This is the intake authorization for the Shell Corporation. It bears Marcus's personal compliance override code, a code that was used while I was physically presenting at a conference in London. I could not have authorized the transfer." The room went completely silent. The board members reviewed the documents. The proof was absolute. The trap had snapped shut, but not on us. Marcus's face drained of color. He looked at the receipt, his leverage evaporating in an instant. The contract he had tried to weaponize was scrapped. The senior partner closed the folder. "Marcus, you will surrender your credentials to security immediately, pending a full external investigation." We had won. Not through luck, but through competence, stamina, and a refusal to break. The aftermath was quiet. 2 hours later, we were back in our windowless conference room, packing up the war room. The whiteboards were erased, the binders were stacked. The crisis was over. I gathered my pens, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. The forced proximity was ending. The partnership contract was fulfilled. Madeline stood by the door holding her briefcase. She looked around the room, then looked at me. So, we go back to our respective corners? I zipped my bag shut. The audit is complete. I walked toward the door. As I reached her, I stopped. The safe distance I had maintained for weeks suddenly felt like a massive error. I didn't want to retreat to my isolated numbers. I wanted the gravity she provided. Madeline didn't move out of the doorway. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a new partnership agreement. Not a temporary audit mandate, but a permanent structural alignment of our divisions. "I'm not going back to my corner, Theo," she said softly. Her eyes were steady. She wasn't waiting for me to lead. She was making a choice. "I want you to co-sign the merger of our departments. I want us to run it together." It was a practical plan, a concrete step, a life upgrade. I looked at the document, then I looked at her. I didn't offer a grand declaration. I didn't need to. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my silver pen, and signed my name next to hers on the solid mahogany table in the hallway. I handed the pen to her, and she signed it, the ink sealing a permanent shift in our reality. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and the noise of the world outside finally went quiet. Closing thoughts. I learned that true integrity isn't just about following the rules. It's about standing firm when the rules are used against you. Healthy love isn't built on dramatic rescues. It is built on the quiet, consistent choices we make to protect each other when the world gets loud. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.